Now we're going to go ahead and talk about some additional form rendering, and this includes how we can modify the template a little bit to prepare for more dynamic forms. We're also going to talk about looking at widgets, or how these forms are rendered by default. And then we'll talk about different HTML elements you might need to add on any given input, such as the CSS class or some sort of other attribute you might want to add. And so if we take a look at this description field, this is a good example, right? So this is a text area, and I can manually move it up and down. But what I want is have it a little bit smaller. I want it to be only a few rows long if you know HTML. So we're going to go ahead and look at that. Now, before we do, I will mention that Django forms have a lot of options. There are almost more options available than you'll probably ever really use in any given project. But it is nice to know that they exist, and it's also nice to know that we can really modify these things quite a bit. So definitely check out the documentation for all of the different elements that are in here. And it's really simple. You just go to ref/forms, and you will find literally all of these different values. And as we see, there's just a lot there. And it's not something I'm going to cover completely. But there are some things that are fundamental that we will want to know. So the first one is going to be to change that description, right? So that description field. Now to do this, we jump into model form, and it's really simple. We just do forms.char field, right? So again, it's a character field, no surprise there. Now we've seen this character field several times at this point, but the main one is in the old article form, right? So we actually called these two right here. And so coming back to that, we have this now as a character field. And if I save that and I refresh on my form, it gets really small. It looks like the character field that's written out from models, right? So of course, just as a refresher, the model field for character field or char field does render out a form character field. No surprise there. So your intuition might be, oh, well, let's do a text field here, just like that, and refresh and keep refreshing. And of course, it doesn't actually work, right? Because there is no actual text field. There's no such thing as a text field. It's still a character field. So either way, it's still a character field. But with the form, what ends up happening is the text area is a type of widget. So what you can do is you can pass in widget equals to forms.text area, just like that. And now it actually brings back the original text area. And of course, I can do this on any of these. So if I change this to name, it's going to override this name here, and it turns that into a text area. And of course, that's not exactly what we want, but it is nice to know that whatever I name this variable, it's going to update what's rendered in the field itself. Okay, so that's pretty cool. So now what I want to do is I want to change my descriptions text area. I want both of these maybe to have only a few rows. So there's two ways to do this, and I'm going to show you both ways. Now, the first way is to come in here into the text area, add in a key value pair for attributes, or ATTRS. Now in here, we can actually pass in the attribute of rows and give it some arbitrary number. So it could be 2, it could be 200. But if we do 2, what we'll get when we refresh, we see that it actually has come down. That's really nice. So one way to do it is actually writing out all of the character field just like that. Another way to do it is to come into the init method and put in args and keyword args. We want to initialize that init method like you would, and then args and keyword args. And now what we do is we do self.fields, and we look for one of the fields that's in here, and we do description and .widget. And of course, that's going to this right here. And then we're going to go ahead and say attributes, and then update, and then the actual update that we want to pass in here. So in our case, we'll say rows being 4 or something along those lines. It could be the integer or the string. It doesn't actually matter there. But this is actually another way to do that. And it requires us to remember quite a few more things, I would imagine, because you're like, okay, well, what is happening here? And then I'm going through and trying to update the same thing, right? So in other words, you need to remember this is how you access the field. Then you need to remember that it's in the widget itself, and then you can do this attributes. So for me, I used this for a very, very long time. Now I tend to lean towards this because of several reasons, which we'll get into in a second. So we save that. And so if I actually come into, let's go ahead and jump into our rendering now. And what we see is, well, it looks like it's going off of this number, right? So if I bring this down to 1 and refresh in there, and sure enough, it is. And that, of course, is because of how I actually initialize it. Initializing it, or that init method, will do this, and then whatever I do here is going to be ultimately what takes hold. So, of course, I don't need to do it that method. But one of the reasons I might actually come in here is, well, for simplicity purposes, I can actually come in and say, directions like that. Okay, so we can refresh, and there we go. So now I have two right next to each other that are showing me, the actual rows themselves. Now that's nice and all, but another reason you might actually end up doing is you can say something like text area updates, and then you actually add in all of the text area updates you might end up using like this, right? And so there's actually a couple of ways on how you can run these updates. You can either pass in a keyword or a dictionary itself, and that would actually update both of those as well. Or you can actually unpack these with the 2 stars, which essentially turns them into keyword arguments. And so we refresh in here again, still working the same way. This, of course, unpacks to being, right now, being rows equals to 1, right? So that's also pretty cool. So this is where we use the init method and how it's really robust for us, because then I can also add in a class of, let's say, for instance, form control, right? So you can add in that class. And of course, I don't actually have anything understanding that class just yet. Like I don't have any CSS implemented, but notice the class is now in there. And it's also showing the attributes here. Now, the other cool thing about this is I can say something like, well, let's give it a max length in here and say 120. Now, max length 120 doesn't actually do anything for our form itself, right? So in here, this doesn't do anything. But if I had JavaScript monitoring this, now I'm not going to be implementing that, but I could have JavaScript monitoring that and looking for it. Now, it wouldn't usually be max length like this. It'd probably be something a little bit more like data max length. And then we probably would put it into a string. And that right there is actually an error in Python. So let's go ahead and bring it into the keyword arguments here. And it's probably still going to be a little bit of an error because of how it's going to open up. So, there is some limitations to doing this method. And so in this case, it does show me that it actually does render that out. So both of those are really useful, I would imagine. Now, it doesn't mean that you're always going to do it this way. It's just nice to know that that exists. Now, there are other arguments that we can add in to any given character field, such as like required or blank or a label. Those things are very well documented in the widgets themselves, as well as the form fields. So if you need to add in required, for example, you can add it in right in there. Now, since I'm using a model form, all of those requirements are actually coming from the model itself, and something I'm not going to customize any further at this point. So now that we understand this, what I want to look at is one other attribute, and that is how these actually render out in the template. So if we look at home or create-update.html, the actual form rendering, and here we did this form.asp. And this is actually great. So this actually works out really well for us in the long run. But sometimes you might want to customize this a little bit more by actually looping through and seeing each individual field. And so we can actually come in here and say for field in form, and then do this in for here. And so now if I actually render out the field only, right? So the actual instance of that field, I can refresh and now it's just fields. That's it, right? So all of those other things, the actual attributes that I added to them are still there, right? So that still exists and it still is a nice thing to have on here. But what's happening is we actually lost everything else. So there are things that you can grab directly from the documentation, and I'll just copy and paste this part here. And that is how we can actually re-add everything essentially that is rendered by default with the form itself. But notice that I can actually have a wrapper for the field itself. I can also have some help classes in here if there is help text. So if I refresh in here, now it's showing something very, very similar to what I had before. And again, still rendering based off of the form, but now it just has a little bit different of a look. And so this is also true about form sets. So what I can do in form sets is, instead of just rendering out the entire form set, what I can do then is I can do something called, I can actually iterate through this. I can say for form in form set, and then we say in for. And then I can do stuff like, let's say, I'll just throw this class in here real quick, and we'll say ingredient form. Now this form ASP, again, can take this exact same method. It can render out the exact same way because it is still an instance of that form. But form classes cannot just render by themselves, or rather,